Hi, welcome to the Semantics lecturelet about reference. Reference, well, reference is something that's very obvious, and then sometimes it's actually not so obvious. At its heart, reference involves the way that linguistic expressions map to objects in the actual world. And on the philosophical side, there is, for a long time, been a huge debate over the nature of that mapping and how direct it is and that sort of thing. And in this course, we're assuming that a very direct approach where the meaning is mapping directly. So, for example, if I use a name like Barack Obama, then the meaning of that expression is the man Barack Obama. That is to say, the expression refers to him. And so we say that an expression is referential when it denotes a particular individual of type E, and in that sense, the meaning is that individual. And we've seen that names are referential expressions, and definite descriptions are as well. So a definite description is simply an NP with a definite determiner. What is a definite determiner? Okay, well, there's another issue, right? But what we know for sure is that properties like happy or dog or president are not referential. They don't refer to individuals. They describe individuals, right? Because if you plug in an individual, you get a truth value, but their meaning is not an individual itself. Intransitive verbs are properties as well. Transitive verbs relate to individuals and so forth, but only the actual simple types will get you reference. Now, noun phrases, noun expressions, and determiner phrases and so forth are often referential, but we'll see that they're not always referential. And we can think of them along a sort of continuum. At the most referential end, we get a notion of definiteness. And these are things like names, the NP constructions, so the dog, that pick out a very specific individual and that will have certain properties. At the other end, we get what is called indefinite, right? The opposite of definite. And these are NPs that are very, indefinite. That is to say, that it's not clear which individual they're picking out, if any. And so NP or some NP, these are classic indefinites. And we won't talk about indefinites for a while because syntactically, semantically, and especially semantically, they differ from definites. They differ in truth conditions, they differ formally, they differ in lots of ways. They won't involve that sort of thing. Definites we'll talk about because they're referential, and we'll kind of slide our way in this direction. Now, definiteness and indefiniteness have been known to philosophers and semanticists for a very long time, but in more recent years, we've seen a category pop up in between. Something that's called specificity. And specificity is even more peculiar, and it's harder to pin down because it's somewhere in between here, and it might be a number of different phenomena we've kind of lumped together. But essentially, specific items are definite enough to identify, but not definite enough to single out or to name. And so we get it in English in certain expressions, like a certain NP, a certain someone. Who is that? Well, maybe I know for sure, but we're not saying. Or if we have the phenomenon called partitives. So, you think of an indefinite, like 4 people showed up versus 4 of the people showed up. Well, we're not saying which 4, but we know that the group is definite, but we don't know which members of the group. So we can narrow it down, can identify them somewhat, but we're not quite definite. And so the relationship between these is intuitively very simple, right? Definite, pick it out, very clear. Specific, we can kind of narrow it down, but we're not exactly sure. Or we are sure, but we're not saying. Indefinite, we're not identifying at all. We might not even know the identity. We just know that the entity is there. And then we can think of them on a continuum, right? Going down in the amount of reference, you could say. But just as with indefinite, specificity, specific MPs are very different beasts formally from definite ones. So we're not going to talk about them yet. And we're not going to talk about these yet. We're only going to talk about the definites. And that's going to be enough for now. And you saw in the reading from that definiteness is a category that cross-linguistically does a lot of interesting things. And what we want to try to understand is how we can bring all of those together. So when we talk about definiteness, right, we essentially are talking about referential expressions. So these expressions that give you something of type E. So what kinds of expressions are those? Well, names do, right? So Neil Armstrong, the name, you can see in 1B. In 1A, we get the phrase, the first person on the moon. Both of these mean Neil Armstrong, right? They're the same guy. Or if you want to say the professor, that singles out me. Or you can use my name. That singles me out too. And so we get a kind of equivalence. The nature of that equivalence is not quite as obvious as you might think. And this has been an important issue throughout the philosophy of language. But for our purposes, until we get more information and until we develop a little more background, we'll take those as equivalent. So the first person on the moon and Neil Armstrong are the same person. And that one's a bit obvious. But the professor and Andrew McKinsey are the same person for now. So how does reference work? Well, we've seen, right? We have a linguistic expression. And this will single out some individual. And that individual is called the referent. So what we want to know is how this expression singles out its referent. Okay. And reference essentially works in 2 ways. Either the speaker mentions something in the common ground of the discourse that everyone knows about, or something that the speaker knows and they expect the listener to figure out. So take the example in 3. If I say, can you get the bag of potatoes out of the pantry? Now, that expression, I say the bag of potatoes. Either for this discourse to make sense, for it to be felicitous, you have to know what I'm talking about. Or I have to expect you to figure it out. So either you know there's a bag of potatoes in the pantry, or I expect you to go and find it, even if you didn't know it was there. And you can go do that. So what does the mean then? What is the bag of potatoes? Well, and I say what does the mean because we want to single out the. We know what a bag is, and then potatoes or of potatoes, or it's full of potatoes. So it's the that's getting us the unique bag that we want. Now, what is the providing? Well, it's providing an air of familiarity, right? So if the speaker is familiar with the referent, I know this bag of potatoes is there, and I expect you to know it's there too, or to figure out that it's there. Right? And this works out pretty well for a case like the bag of potatoes, but it works out in more general cases too. So the bag of potatoes is what Lyons calls situational familiarity, right? There could, sometimes there's a bag of potatoes there, sometimes there's not. There happens to be now. I know that situation, and I'm expecting you to know it. But it can be something more general. Like, for instance, if I say, look at the moon, right? The moon is the moon. There's just the one. We all know what it is. It's a general kind of familiarity. You could say it's a broad version of situational. It's just a really broad situation. Then there's what's called anaphoric familiarity. And anaphora is a kind of reference that involves the discourse that we've been having. So for instance, in 5, I say, there was a breakdancer on the bus today. I gave the man $1. So a breakdancer is indefinite. I'm not identifying him. I might not know anything about him except the fact that he was breakdancing on the bus today and that he's a man. I say, I gave the man $1. So now the breakdancer has been introduced into this conversation, and the man is referring to that entity as a part of the conversation. And so we say that this is a case of anaphora, and the expression referring back to him is an anaphor. So in semantics, we use that term more broadly than we do in syntax. In semantics, an anaphor is anything that refers to the context. Whether it's bound, if it's bound, then it's not an anaphor. We'll see more about that later. So in the semantics, an anaphor is not something bound. It refers to something in the discourse. And in a lot of languages, we get specific forms that will distinguish anaphors to the discourse versus anaphors out in the world. We can also use linguistic expressions to refer to things that are going to be talked about. So for instance, in 6, we say, when the doctor comes, tell her your symptoms. Well, look at the phrase her. What does her refer to? Well, it bounces back to doctor. But then, in a sense, the doctor is bouncing forward to her. And so we'd say that that is a case of forward anaphora or cataphora. Cataphora, anaphora. So this is bearing backwards, bearing forwards, if you're into Greek. And a cataphor works like an anaphor, but in the other direction. So an anaphor refers back to what you talked about. A cataphor refers to what you're going to be talking about. And cataphors are more restricted syntactically. They're usually found in subordinate clauses and so forth. So familiarity. If you know what I'm talking about, then the definite is allowed. Another time the definiteness is allowed is when it's identifiable. So that's the case where I know the referent, and I expect you to be able to identify the referent. So this allows us to talk about definite individuals whose referent we don't even know yet. So for instance, in 7, I say the winner of the event will be a hero. Well, how can the winner of the event refer to an individual? I don't even know who's won the event, whoever it is, right? So we kind of create this individual, and you expect you to figure out what I mean. But it's precise enough I can use the. Or we can talk about bridging. Bridging occurs when we have a situation, and then that in the discourse, and then we use a definite expression as a situational, and a kind of situational familiarity or identifiability. So, give an example. So if I say, I took the turnpike yesterday, the toll taker was polite. I can't identify the toll taker. I don't remember anything about him. And you obviously couldn't identify the toll taker. You weren't even there. But this is acceptable, the toll taker. Why? Well, because in the context I just provided, we know that there'll be a toll taker. And so I'm talking about that person. Or like at 9, I drove by a wedding yesterday. The bride wore camo. Right? For a wedding, you can expect there to be a bride. Or if I say the bride, you can figure out which person at the wedding it was, even though you don't know what wedding it was or who was involved. So, we take all these factors together: familiarity, identifiability, and then there's uniqueness. Uniqueness is important as well. The referent, that is to say, it's unique in the sense that the referent is the only relevant object with that description. So, when I say sit at the desk, there better be one desk that you can either identify or that you know about already. So for instance, if you and your friend enter a classroom, it's got tons of desks in it, and you tell your friend sit at the desk, that's not felicitous. Why not? Well, because it's not unique. There are a lot of desks, and you can't identify which one you meant. But if I said stand at the lectern, okay, you can figure that out. You can find where that lectern is and go stand there, because there's only going to be the one. If there were more than one, well, then you'd be confused. So we have familiarity, identifiability, and uniqueness. Now we're going to formulate a meaning out of that. When we want to formulate the meaning of the, we want to ask, right, it covers all of these meanings. Is it because we have a lot of different does, the ambiguity approach? Or is it because we have one the that can cover all of these meanings, the vagueness approach? Well, ideally we want to use the vagueness approach if we can, because ideally there's only one the. There might not be, right? We can't find compatible conditions. But if we can find a bunch of compatible conditions, we should stick with the one. Well, Frege, of all people, again, developed an analysis that captured many of the features of the, and it was questioned later and then reestablished in the 50s. But the idea is pretty straightforward and involves presupposition. Right? Presupposition is a property of expressions by which the speaker of the utterance, expects the listener to know what they're talking about. In fact, he expects everyone to know what they're talking about. So that basically captures familiarity. If I say, get the bag of potatoes in the pantry, I'm presupposing that there is a bag of potatoes in the pantry. And that only works if I expect you to know there's a bag of potatoes in the pantry. So what about identifiability? Well, that works when then the presupposition will work in the case of accommodation. If I say, hey, have you met my sister? And you didn't know I have a sister, you can accommodate that presupposition and identify the sister. Right? That's the same kind of mechanism. So when I say get the bag of potatoes from the pantry, I presuppose there's a bag of potatoes, and you can accommodate that presupposition. If you don't accommodate the presupposition, then we get infelicity, right? So if I say get the bag of potatoes from the pantry, and you know there's not one, then you say, wait, there's not a bag of potatoes? And then we can have an argument about whether there is or not. But the point is, you have not accommodated the presupposition, and so it doesn't work. Duh doesn't work. So, what about uniqueness? Well, that doesn't come out of the presupposition itself. We have to put it in the presupposition. And so for Frege, what he came up with was this notion that the expresses a presupposition of uniqueness. That is to say, the speaker knows it is unique and expects the speaker to know it too. So the object has to exist, at least in the universe we're talking about, and it has to be unique in the relevant context as far as having the property goes. So that would cover the cases that we've seen, right? The bag of potatoes, I presuppose there's a bag of potatoes. Right? And I presuppose it's the only bag of potatoes in the pantry. If there are 5 bags of potatoes and I say go get the bag of potatoes, you're going to be confused. If I say go get a bag, right, that's indefinite. We're not making any presuppositions of that sort. And then there might not be any. and I'd still be saying something felicitous. So I want something where there has to be one in there. So when would the fail? And if we know what the means, it presupposes uniqueness, which it entails the presupposition of existence. So it has to exist and it has to be unique. So when does the fail? Well, it fails when it's not unique or doesn't exist. So if there's one, we can say the. And since it's presupposed, it has to be familiar. So if it's presuppositional, then it has to be familiar. So if the is not, if I say the bag of potatoes and you don't know what I'm talking about, or if there is no bag, or if there are 5 bags, the is going to fail. And so there's a famous example that Frege gives. It says, a sentence like, the king of France is bald. Well, why does that work? Why is that weird? Well, because there's no king of France. Or if I said, the emperor of Kansas is bald. Is that true or is it false? Well, it's hard to tell, right? Because there is no emperor of Kansas. We can't determine if that person is bald or not. Now, if there's more than one object, right? If I say, I met the senator from Kansas, well, there are 2 senators from Kansas. So how can I tell if that's true or false? I don't know which one you're talking about. So this presupposition, like any presupposition, will survive negation. It will survive an if clause. So if I say, I didn't meet the governor of Kansas, right? Presupposition holds. If I say, if I met the governor of Kansas, would I get a picture? Again, presupposition holds. So this works just as we'd expect it to if it is a presupposition of uniqueness. And then in another lecture, we'll see how the composition works because the composition will introduce a new concept of functions as an argument. But for now, we think about definiteness, right? Definiteness ties into reference. Right? Reference involves linguistic expressions that mean something of type E, that point to an actual individual, whether in the realm of what we're talking about, and whether we can really identify them or not. It can be a little iffy, right? The use of the presupposes uniqueness, it presupposes existence, and it presupposes familiarity. And these semantic facts are tied to the word the in English. But we'll see that they're tied to other words too. They're tied to other kinds of expressions. And since the meaning is there, we have to wonder, where else do we see definiteness in natural language?